and welcome to another segment of VetsTV. I'm Jared Levinson, along with my co-host, Bill Uren. Today we're focusing on the service to our country of our Vietnam veterans, and we're very proud and honored to have with us two distinguished veterans from the Vietnam War. Bobby Hovis, who was the first U.S. Navy nurse to set up the first Navy medical facility hospital in Vietnam in only 4 days, and we'll hear that story. And Dan Hoogland, who is a Purple Heart winner from the Vietnam War, and his daughter, Heather McCasey, who is also with us, and a representative of Maryland Public Television. And we're also here to promote the upcoming MPT special honoring our Vietnam veterans, to appear on Maryland Public Television May 24th, 25th, and 26th. And also a special event at the Timonium Fair coming up in June, which Heather will talk about, Maryland LZ, which will be a big event at the fairgrounds to honor our Vietnam veterans. Let's start with Bobby Hovis, who went to Vietnam in 1963?
Correct.
What led you to Vietnam? How did you wind up in Vietnam?
Well, I think I would go back to the Korean War, since I was in the Korean War as a Navy flight nurse. I was a very junior nurse then, and I did fly Vietnam, Korean casualties from Yokosuka, Japan, back to the States via Hawaii. So I was always interested in military nursing anyway, and I've done a lot of flying, and I have a great love of flying, so I wanted to be a Navy flight nurse. So I was that, and then with my qualifications, with one more, and also flying, I was the first to volunteer the first Navy nurse to volunteer for Vietnam duty. The excitement, the type of patients we had really were special men. They were all there for a purpose. There was no draft. They were not drafted. They were there, many of them, on a volunteer basis, as were we nurses. And it just, I don't know, I can't guess it was in my blood. I wanted to be a military nurse, a Navy flight nurse, and I was.
Could you tell us what it was like when you first arrived in Vietnam? What greeted you, and what were the tasks ahead of you?
Yeah, yes, I can, because I won't forget it. We had a very long flight across the Pacific, and landed in Saigon at mid-morning, and the aircraft had been nicely air-conditioned, and they opened the hatches on the aircraft, and we stepped down one step, and it was as if we were walking into a blast furnace. It was really, really, really hot. Well, our chief nurse met us, and she took us to a debriefing shack where we were briefed on what was going to happen the rest of the day. And it was had a window fan. Well, that wasn't very cool, but nevertheless, we survived it all. And then we were taken to our quarters and settled in, and we were then briefed by our commanding officer, and he told us that we had 96 hours to set up a naval hospital. Now, that's a hospital, 100 beds, from a very small dispensary that was associated with the embassy. So when we saw the building that we had to convert into a hospital and the time we had to do it, we all nearly set our hair on fire and flew back out to Tan Son Nhut Airport, and I jumped on the first plane home. But ridiculous, of course. And so we did it. We had Navy nurses and the corpsmen, Navy corpsmen, and we are the ones who put that hospital into shape to receive casualties. And we were commissioned on 1 October 1963, and it was a big affair. The embassy staff, and we had a band, and it was great. So then we were in operation, and we were in operation for a little over 2 years.
What's involved with converting a small dispensary into a giant military hospital with over 100 beds?
Just the first thing that comes to mind is just moving in the equipment, just the hospital beds themselves. The building itself, the workers were still, the elevator was still of the French vintage. The old wire caged elevator with this type handle, and all of that had to be converted, and the heads were unbelievable. But eventually, on that fourth day, we were such a proud crew because we had done that. We practically worked night and day, scrubbing and cleaning and moving in supplies and making up the beds, and just a whole lot of things.
And how large was this staff?
We had 80 corpsmen and 7 nurses. We had an American School of Nursing in Bangkok, and we called on those little Thai nurses. They were pretty well trained, and they were a big help.
When you look back at those days, what do you feel was the most significant lessons that you took away from that experience?
There were so many. I know when it came time for me to leave, and I look back on it, I didn't want to leave. I loved the people. I loved taking care of those patients. Later, we got some that were not as desirable as our first group, mostly all volunteers, as I said. They would pester me in my, I had the IC, intensive care unit, emergency room, operating room sometimes. These men were some of the best I had ever cared for in my career. And I can remember them saying smaller injuries and wounds and whatever. They would pester me, oh, Commander, can't you get me better sooner? I need to get back to my friends, to my men and to the field. And I'd have to mollycoddle them and say, no, you're not ready yet, but you will be soon, and that quieted them to the next time. But that's the kind of fellows they were, and I appreciated them so well. They were the best patients I'd ever had.
We have a gentleman here who's wearing a Purple Heart and perhaps received some treatment from a Navy nurse at some point.
I received a lot of treatment from Navy nurses.
How would you describe their performance in the field?
Superb isn't adequate. They were superb nurses. The doctors that treated me after I was shot were truly the best. I had an orthopedic surgeon who pioneered things that are now common practice, but when he did it, it had never been heard of before. I can't compliment Navy medicine enough.
Let me ask you about the road that led you to Vietnam. How did you get to Vietnam?
I enlisted in the Marine Corps when I was 17. At the time, Vietnam was becoming a big issue, but it hadn't reached anywhere near the crescendo it eventually reached. I spent almost a year with the 2nd Marine Division in North Carolina, did what's called a Mediterranean cruise. So at 18 years old, I got to climb the Acropolis in Athens, see bullfights in Madrid. It was very, very exciting time for an 18-year-old. When I returned, Vietnam had escalated, and most of the group I was with were given orders to Vietnam. Trained for about a month in California, and I was with a group that was transported to Vietnam by sea. We left the United States on November the 10th, 1966, which was the Marine Corps birthday. We sailed to Vietnam by way of Okinawa. We had a one-day layover there, and we arrived in Da Nang. We were transported to a municipal park where Marines had first landed in 1965 called Red Beach. And it was from there that we were assigned to our various units. I ended up at the top of the country in what was called the I Corps with the 3rd Battalion of the 4th Marines, and spent most of my time up along the edge of the DMZ. In 1967, following Hill 881, which was a massive battle, my unit had been pulled out of country. We were redeployed into country, and at that time I was with a unit that went all the way through the DMZ to the line of demarcation between North and South Vietnam, and managed to fill my canteens in that stream. And then as the operations continued, moved across the DMZ, ultimately to a hill that was right on the border between the DMZ and South Vietnam, Hill 174. And then, simply stated, we had a very rough day, and I unfortunately got in the way of a machine gun that had already killed 2 of my friends and was trying to take me out too. I was just a little luckier and a little faster, I guess.
What was it like after you came home to the United States? What was your life like on arrival back here?
Being in the hospital was, again, a good experience. That was fine. After being separated from the service, life became surreal. Like a lot of Vietnam veterans, I came home to a country that had no understanding of where I had been or what I had done, and for whatever reasons was almost contemptuous of us. And when I went to college, some people I think were shocked that I'd been to Vietnam, I'd been in the Marine Corps, and I could actually construct a sentence with more than 3 words and words of more than 1 syllable.
Bill's very good at that.
Yeah, they were surprised when I was retired out of the Marine Corps and showed up at Stanford Law School too. So, but I was able to construct a couple of sentences. They were surprised. Professors were very surprised at that. Fortunately, a couple of professors I had at Stanford were guys who had spent a few years in World War II in Europe, and so they had a little different understanding of my problems and so forth. So, but I think that what he's saying is very, very true. I think that people really misunderstood that somehow Vietnam veterans were somehow a different breed of cat than was in Korea or was in Second World War or maybe the First World War or the Civil War or the Revolutionary War. And the unfortunate problem is people missed the boat because they were all the same people and they were put under very difficult conditions in Vietnam. And so I think that my impression of my Marines when I was in Vietnam was that they were the best there ever was and the best there ever will be. I've heard a lot of commandants of the Marine Corps talk about their Marines, and each one of them has said just exactly what I said to you. But that's, I think, the important point is that the Vietnam veteran or the Vietnam guy was of as good a quality as any man who served in World War II. He was not as old, but he certainly was of fine quality. My battalion commander in Vietnam had fought in World War II. He had also fought in Korea. He went into Incheon and came out of the Choshin Reservoir with the Marine Corps. And he would tell me and others, whoever would listen to them, that these Marines that he had in Vietnam were as good as any Marine he had ever seen, and he'd served in 2 wars prior to the Vietnam War. So I think the problem that, for some reason, the American public, partly because maybe of the media and other things, got the impression that somehow these guys were in Vietnam and somehow that changed them.
Let me ask this question. We talk about the circumstances that led to the assignment. In looking forward to the assignment before you went, with the knowledge you had at that time or were given, because sometimes there's a difference between what they tell you and what it's like when you get there. How were the circumstances you faced perhaps different or similar to what you have been prepared to face or what you ultimately faced?
Well, I would say that among my nursing staff group, I was the best prepared. I had been through Korea, and I was 33 years old. I was a very experienced Navy nurse by then. So it was easier for me probably than our younger nurses who had never been in a wartime situation.
Did they find the situation to be perhaps very different from what they had thought they would be facing?
I think they did, and we actually were put through a few tough times there. The coup d'etats that went on and the firing in very close to our quarters. They fired whoever they were, 105 millimeter shells into the city, trying to hit Xiem's palace, and we lived, our quarters were 5 blocks away. So we took some very close hits of 105s, and they were pretty scared. I went out on the balcony. I didn't want to miss a thing, so I was on the floor of the balcony on my belly looking over the side, watching all of the activities. But no, it was, the younger nurses were quite
Rattled by this?
somewhat, but Navy nurses are strong and they get through, and but it's just a matter of experience as far as mine and theirs. So.
And how about your experience as a young man heading out
Okay.
at 17?
At the time I enlisted in the Marine Corps, Vietnam hadn't pushed training schedules to a point that they were being shortened. As an infantryman, I went through the normal infantry training and then was part of a group that was sent to what's called advanced combat training. I had covered an awful lot of weapons training, an awful lot of tactical training before I ever got to the 2nd Marine Division. The Med Cruise was just a big training operation from start to finish. And the preparation just before leaving to go to Vietnam was very thorough. When I got in country, we had a battalion commander who, like your battalion commander, was a product of World War II. In fact, he was what's called a Mustang. He had enlisted in the Marine Corps as a private and was now a lieutenant colonel. Name was William Masterpool, and before anybody got to go out to their assigned companies, we spent a day and a half being lectured to about local customs, about what to expect, about what was going on. I don't think any training prepares you for the first time you're shot at. That is an experience that is both frightening and exhilarating, especially if you don't get hit. But my preparation for what I was doing, certainly the Marine Corps never shortchanged me on that. I was fully prepared. The first time I was shot at, it was a surprise, but it wasn't, and I had always understood from day one that if you enlist in the U.S. Marine Corps, you're engaging in a high-risk occupation. So the fact that I was in combat, the fact that I was being shot at, or having mortars dropped on us, the biggest fear was that with a lot of those things, you didn't know where they were going to land. But the fact that they were shooting them at us, that was not a surprise.
When you came home and Heather's a little girl, what were your thoughts about trying to discuss with Heather as she grew up, or
Okay.
building some understanding about what you had been
Okay.
through? Is that
Heather was born 8 years after I got back. I was a bachelor when I was in the service. I don't think I ever went out of my way to harp on my military record or experience. Certainly made no effort to conceal it. And when questions were asked, because both she and her sister asked questions, I tried to do my very best to give them complete and honest answers. It's a difficult concept for children to understand. I now have 3 grandsons, and the 2 older boys know that Papa was in the Marines and Papa was in a war. I don't think they really have a real deep understanding of what any of that means yet.
do you think that, Heather, what's your thought about that?
Yeah, when I was really little, I knew that my father was a Marine. I knew that, he had served. We would go to the naval base on weekends, go to the commissary and PX and things like that. So I was aware of it. I didn't understand it. I knew my dad was different. I knew he was different from the other dads because he had been to war. But I think that it was when I was in middle school, when my middle school guidance counselor started recognizing that there were a lot of kids in the room that had no clue about Vietnam and didn't really understand it, and the curriculum wasn't covering it. He had invited my dad in to speak, and I remember you doing that. And that was the first time I saw pictures or really heard stories about your service. And
And how old were you at that point?
I want to say 11 or 12. I was probably in 6th or 7th grade. And, with the exception of one classmate whose name shall remain anonymous, I think most of my classmates were pretty respectful of my dad, even if they didn't understand what having come from a military family meant. But I think that started opening, and that was probably an age-appropriate time for us to start talking as father and daughter about what was going on, what had happened in your experience.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Father, was your experience of coming home, and as the time passed, what was your experience with children and grandchildren?
Well, I came home, Portsmouth Naval Hospital, huge naval hospital, and I was in charge of the intensive care unit there. And I had a lot of Vietnam casualties that were area backed in. And I knew what days the helicopters were coming. And to this day, I cannot forget the sound of a Huey helicopter overhead. I know what it is. I don't even have to look up. I look forward to taking care of those Vietnam vets, especially when I took over that ICU. One of our doctor friends, he was at Dong Ha, and he had a young Marine that had been wounded, and they already knew he was slated for Portsmouth, Virginia. So he wrote a note to me via this young fella, and it said, "Bobby, when you receive this patient, he will give you a note, and on it, it will say, you must get this boy a chocolate milkshake." He came all the way from Dong Ha to my unit and handed me that note.
Did you get him a milkshake?
I immediately went down to the PX. I knew when I saw Bill, the doctor, again, that if I hadn't done so, he would have really given me the business.
Bill, did you have any thoughts on coming home and talking to, you had raised a couple of...
No, fortunately, I was older and already had a wife and 2 kids, and so it was different for me than it was for a lot of the younger people who were coming home, and I swore to get out of the hospital. I had to swear to never sue a doctor, and then I got out of the hospital and went to law school. But it was not as difficult. It was, but I knew from my experience with undergraduates and other people that for others it was very difficult, and it was not pleasant for younger people coming home. I was experienced and been around. I'd been on active duty in the Marine Corps for 10 years, so it was not like, I was coming home and I was 19 years old. I think the biggest problem was the young people came home to their, like you saw in the movie, the Deer Hunter and places like that, where you walked into your local bar and so forth. You were no longer the same guy who left, and that's too bad. And I think guys face that, and coming home to their location. And I think people are now trying to say, gee, thank for your service and all so forth. I tell people it was my privilege to serve with my Marines. They were great guys, and I wouldn't have missed it for the world. And I think that they don't understand that at all. They look at me like, they just don't get that at all. But they weren't there. And I think the one thing that, and I can tell a whole bunch of stories, but I know we're at the end of the segment, and so what I was going to say is simply that guys knew their buddies, they took care of their buddies. They may not know who the Commandant of the Marine Corps was, and they may not know who I was as a commander, but they knew who their fire team and their squad leader was, and they knew who their Marine next to them. And let me tell you, they took really good care as best they could of everybody around them and all the corpsmen they were with. All their corpsmen were called Doc, and they were treated like they were the king, because they knew that when they were wounded, that corpsman, and I can tell you some stories, but I won't at this point, about corpsmen and what they did for guys. And I wouldn't be here if there wasn't been a corpsman in the squad that I was with when I was wounded. So that should tell you everything. But as far as coming home is concerned, I was older, and I just would not listen to any of these people who wanted to give me this anti-war stuff. I looked at them and walked off. So I was not going to listen, and they knew that. So.
If I may, I'm going to repeat something I said to Bobby and a couple of other people earlier today.
Please.
For those who have been there, no explanation is necessary. For those who haven't, no explanation is possible. It's a whole different world.
At the MPT event at the airport last month or so, after the viewing was finished, somebody came up to me and they said, "Would you do that all over again?" And I said, in a heartbeat, I would do it all over again. I said, those Vietnam patients were the best I'd ever had, and I was proud to take care of those kids. And I don't know if she was surprised that I would say that or not, but I think a lot of us feel that way.
Yeah.
In a heartbeat, we go back.
I want to thank all three of you, and Bill Uren, for coming today and speaking to us about these things. And I want to thank all of you for your service to our country as well. The way in which you've just summed that up puts it in very good proper perspective. And again, remember, we have the MPT special or Vietnam veterans coming up May 24th and 25th and 26th. And we have
LZ Maryland taking place at the Maryland State Fairgrounds, June 18th and 19th.
And there'll be lots of great activities.
Lots of great activities, lots of fun. Families are welcome. This is really about celebrating Vietnam veterans, welcoming their families, and celebrating and honoring their service and giving them the welcome they so deserve.
For my co-host Bill Uren, Thank you again for watching Vets TV. I'm Jared Levinson. We will see you again on Vets TV on MCTV, Channel 15. Thank you very much for watching.